Before we get started, I just wanted to give a special thanks to the lovely gent, scholar, and host of the Channel 83 podcast for suggesting this week's review. He's a great bunch of lads, and I highly recommend you check him out when you're next looking to satiate your podcasting requirements. "1990s Demon Cop" is, well, I'm not entirely sure what this movie is. I guess it's a sort of horror, but that implies that someone out there would be scared of this, which I very much doubt. It's not an action movie either, despite the multiple ludicrous fight scenes. It has drama elements, and it has a ghost of a fart of a thriller vibe about it in places, but neither of those fit right either, I'll be honest. I suppose it's fair to say that Demon Cop is all things as it is nothing, and I think depending on where you sit in terms of bad movie tolerance, you'll either think this is one of the most ridiculous hammy train wrecks you've ever seen, or a totally boring non-film that just so happens to be peppered with the occasional entertaining moment. The film's plot is kind of irrelevant because you're not watching this for the deep and detailed narrative that weaves our characters together. You're watching this to get to the final act when Demon Cop starts throwing patio furniture about while philosophizing about the human condition. But if you must have a plot, well, alright. But there's going to be a lot of meanwhiles here, just so you've been warned. Demon Cop follows two cops called Spencer and Logan as they explore a string of mysterious and grisly deaths that are believed to be gang-linked. The main supporting beam of this plot is that these cops start by interviewing gang members, and by slowly piecing together the clues left by the killer, they eventually arrive at a prime suspect who goes by the name of Edward. Meanwhile, while the cops are working their way to Edward himself is having a bit of trouble. You see, Edward was an ex-parole officer. He lost his wife and unborn child and was later let go from his job as a parole officer, and while winding down his work on the streets, he became the victim of a gangland drive-by. Edward was then given a blood transfer which just so happened to be from a European donor who also happened to carry the curse of the demon blood. A 500-year-old curse that transfers via bloodlines and slowly transforms the poor unfortunate soul who's received the blood into a vengeful demon who seeks retribution on the people who've wronged them. The power of the demon is largely controlled by the waxing of the moon. When it's at its least fullest, Edward has the most control over his demon powers, but when it's at its fullest, he transforms completely and basically becomes a wild animal. And as time goes by, Edward slowly begins to lose more and more of what control he had as the demon blood begins to take over his whole body. Meanwhile, while all this is going on between Edward and the cops, there's also an ex-German Interpol agent known at first only by his nickname, Bloodhound, but later by the name Horst Steinfeld, because I think that matters, who's been tracking down the stray blood for a good chunk of his career. The demon blood originated in Europe, and he's basically been almost semi-Van Helsing his way through the bloodline with the aim of getting rid of it. Unfortunately, Interpol got wind of his last killing and didn't believe him when he said he was trying to end a 500-year-old cursed bloodline, so he was fired and charged with murder. So, he fled the country. His subplot revolves around him coming to America to trace down the donor who gave Edward his blood and ultimately Edward himself. He tries to convince a local DJ to air a warning to be on the lookout for suspicious goings-on, but they think he's a crank and tell him to do one. Eventually, he manages to persuade the DJ to attend a meeting with him where he tells her everything and, well, let's not beat around the bush here, nothing happens. His entire character arc ends with an elongated phone call to the police where he basically tells them everything he knows, and we get to see it on screen, before he disappears from the movie never to be seen again. Meanwhile, we also have to keep Kelly in mind. Kelly is Edward's kinda, sorta love interest. I'm pretty sure they're a couple, but Lord knows how. Kelly was an ex-gang member who Edward helped rehabilitate. She's also aware of Edward's problems and is trying to hide him from the world while they figure out a way to try and cure him. Her character is in this largely to A, add even more exposition to the plot for scenes they couldn't afford to film, B, give Edward a bit more of a human element, and C, to act as the person in the third act who Edward trusts enough to come to in order for the police to run a sting to try and get him. Cue patio furniture stage left. She has her own B-plot and arc as well, but much like Bloodhound, it doesn't really go anywhere. It doesn't really lead to anything, and you're none the better for having it. All of these elements, and more, just kind of bob about next to each other and vaguely lead us to one of the most bizarrely charming final fights and closes that I've seen in the last 8 to 10 weeks. By the skin of its teeth, I am legally obliged to say that this film had a script. But I hasten to add that I'm playing by FDA rules, and when I say that, they think that pizza is a vegetable. So make of that what you will. This isn't coherent plot making. This feels like 3 movies got into a blender together and it feels unfinished. I have to say that this film has a plot because there is a pretty clear progression from beginning to middle to end, but that doesn't mean it's in any way good or coherent as a plot. And the problem is it's difficult to explain it, but the film becomes overly complex, not because it's overwritten or got some big-brain genius writer on board, but rather because they've shoved about 6 different storylines into this movie, 3 of which don't have formal endings and 5 of which don't have any kind of structuring at all, and that's before I get to the glaring issue that all of them are incredibly stupid. There's no pacing, the film heats up and cools down repeatedly throughout with no sense of direction and a weird fixation on the AIDS virus. I realise AIDS was a hot topic issue in the late 80s and early 90s, but they throw the word AIDS around in the same way that someone might say hey or see you later. Despite the fact that no one in this film actually has AIDS, my best guess is that they're going for some kind of metaphor where the burning sense of vengeance inside a person with demon blood works similarly to a then terminal disease? I don't know, but it's a really odd thing to repeatedly ram into this weird experience of a movie. That's not to say that this film isn't a fun watch, but it's only really entertaining if you specifically like this kind of car crash cinema. A lot of it's down to performance choice, editing choice, and direction. The script? Well, it's pretty dire. The first half is painfully slow in setting everything up, and the second half, while quite a bit pacier, fails to pick up enough goodwill for me to really totally be won over by it. And depending on your preference for bad dialogue, this movie will either pay out in dividends for you or be insufferable. For me, I fall into the former camp. The dialogue is so impossibly awful in places in this film that I couldn't help but burst out laughing regularly. This film was written and directed by Rocco Karega, and if you want an idea of the quality behind this, he has 1 writing credit and 1 directing credit, and both of those are for this. He also has 4 acting credits that largely amount to walk-on or extras roles, and this was the last film he had any involvement in. The script was also co-directed by Hal Miles. He has 4 directing credits, mainly for short films or movies that are listed as being in pre-production. If you filter those out, he has 1 directing credit, this film. That, I think, would normally be all you'd need to hear to know exactly what kind of amateur hour we're dealing with here. But what is surprising is he actually has quite a prestigious career working in special effects. He has 49 credits for pretty big movies like Starship Troopers, The Abyss, and Terminator 2 Judgment Day, which gave me total tonal whiplash because that means at least half of the team involved in making this must have had some degree or understanding of the filmmaking process. They must have had some connections. You don't get to work on movies like the aforementioned and not make some friends who know how to make a movie. And yet, here we find ourselves. The direction is hilarious, it's disastrously awful. Now, I mean, I'll give them baseline credit here, the lens cap is off, the camera is pointing the right way, I believe some kind of tripod has been used for the most of this, but it's just so utilitarian in its execution. It's functional and that's it. There's very little in the way of creative visuals beyond the demon cop prosthetics, and about 95% of the shots are often just locked off mid-shots, two shots, or head and shoulder shots of people. The functional nature of the direction often works to the opposite of the intended effect, with some wide shots hanging around for way too long and creating an uncomfortably funny viewing experience. This is not a pretty film by any measure, and I think anyone who hasn't had formal training in film production, who was given control of this film with the resources that this filmmaker had, would have probably made a film of the same quality, if not slightly better. There are just so many missed opportunities or half-baked ideas. And as someone who's studied film, worked in the industry professionally, and does this show for 35 to 45 weeks of the year, I had an absolute blast at cringing at all the weird direction, Cine and editing choices. Because, oh yeah, the Cine's pretty awful too. There's rarely any kind of framing in these shots. I mean, it's set up so that heads aren't cut off, but 9 times out of 10 it feels like scenes were constructed on the day, on the fly, based on what looked okay or cool through the viewfinder. Quite often people are just centred in the shot, with no sense of depth or any kind of surrounding action. And there are only a few exceptions, usually on shorter closed set or studio sequences where it appears that they were able to swing a lighting kit. It's quite frequently the case that it looks like they shot for coverage, got a couple of cutaway shots that looked okay, and then unless they felt they were onto a good thing, they just left it at that. The two sequences that stick in my mind on the bad direction and Cine front are both sequences involving the German Interpol officer. One in which he's walking for what seems like a year via a long tracking shot which eventually loses him as it follows him around a public space. And the other is a massive exposition sequence that runs to about 15 years and only has 2.5 angles. It feels super lazy and is definitely uninspired. Which I guess is another reason I think it works so well with the editing. It amplifies the craptitude exponentially. Like, had it got some decent sequences but flat direction, it wouldn't nearly be as good as a bad movie. Likewise, if it had half decent direction but was just lazily shot, I probably wouldn't be here telling you how awful this film was and why if you like bad movies you need to see this one. The editing is atrocious. And I'm an editor, and I've never seen a professionally released film cut like this. It's insane. Most sequences either overcut or undercut, as in you'll have sequences that have 50,000 cuts that occupy about 20 seconds of time in film, or you'll have a 5-minute long sequence that's made up of 2 shots and that's it. And they clearly didn't shoot any safety footage. The takes you see in this film are the only takes, because this movie's full of flubs, badly delivered lines, outtakes and random footage. There's no rhythm in the pacing, they don't cut with any level of technical skill. It really feels like someone assembled a rough cut and then let their 10-year-old play around with the edit for a couple of hours while they went to the supermarket. It's painful. They don't just cut either. Most of the time they'll crossfade, which in editing is generally used to show the passage of time. But they use it here in almost every cut they make. And when they do use a standard cut, it's more often than not a hard cut that either comes too soon and cuts people off mid-sentence, or comes way too late and just sort of leaves the cast hanging around. But Dan, I hear you cry, what about the flashbacks or when they actually need to show the passing of time? Well, they use a fade to and fade from white, and in one very specific case a fade to black. Why they only have one fade to black but half a dozen or so fade to whites, I don't know, and apparently neither did the producer, the director or the editor. But here we are. It's the messiest edit I've seen outside of SOV movies, and while I don't think I can give it the honour of being the worst cut film I've ever seen just yet, I'm really struggling to think of ones that are cut worse. The soundtrack's a load of bollocks. That's all I have to say. It's pretty much all super cheap synth stuff, the dredges of the low no-budget feature, If you've ever seen a low, no-budget horror or sci-fi or action film from the late 1980s, you pretty much know the sound I'm talking about. But yeah, it's awful. But that's not what I want to talk about in this part. What I want to talk about in this part is the awful ADR. About 60% of the film is ADR'd, or dubbed in post to the non-cool kids. They literally re-recorded actors' lines after filming because the on-site audio was either too crappy to use, or worse, they didn't bother to grab any on-site audio. And it sounds like it was recorded over a telephone. They clearly didn't get any room tone when they shot the film because the ADR stuff doesn't even try to match the on-set audio. There's no Atmos tracks, they sound overly tinny and don't match the tone or pace of any character's actual on-set deliveries. The most infamous moment being a 5-minute exposition scene where Kelly clearly needs to catch a train or something because she's speeding through the script that she's clearly reading from as if her life depends on it. It's unprocessed, unmastered, and much like the direction, it creates some of the most hilarious moments in the film. As an actor will turn their back to the camera for 5 seconds and just have this spew of dialogue spring forth that was captured after the fact. It's hilarious. So, the audio's crap, the soundtrack's crap, the editing's crap, the direction and Cine are crap, and the script needs a citation. Surely there's some good performances that'll win over the arthouse crowd. Well, no, they're all absolutely awful too. Again, with hilarious results because a lot of the cast in this seemingly believe they're a lot better than they actually are. Starting things off, our titular demon cop is none other than writer and director of Demon Cop, Rocco Karega. And he's awful in my opinion. He only really has 2 styles of performance, which are man who thinks he's being wise beyond his years but sounds constipated, and man who thinks he could play a believable Incredible Hulk but weighs 112 pounds and sounds constipated. What I'm saying is, he's not very good in this, and he may need more fibre in his diet. The cops are stereotypical 80s cops, with Logan in particular being very unusual in the sense that he's more upset that he's missing out on his Hawaiian vacation than the fact that there's a mysterious demon killer savaging people on his turf. The priorities are all over the place, and it's really weird. Julia Westland as Kelly is the driest acting performance I've seen in a long time. She just can't emote. It's like she's got an affliction against feelings. From the saddest scenes in the film to moments where she's supposed to be showing sheer terror, she's just got nothing. Did I mention Cameron Mitchell's in this film? Because the film sure as fuck forgets he is. He's playing the most half-hearted narrative device going. He plays an asylum doctor who opens and closes the film explaining that the movie we're watching is a flashback based on medical notes. He's not in the film, barring collectively around 3 minutes worth of footage, and worse still, that footage wasn't even shot for Demon Cop specifically. Mitchell also used the costume, set and basic character to film scenes for another film shot around the time that got long delayed, 1995's Jacko. And he's better in Jacko than he is in this, which is absurd. There's not a single solid performance in this film. No one gives a crap about this movie, and everyone is playing half-heartedly or just goofing around. It's astounding. Demon Cop was released in the UK on VHS in 1991 by Colourbox Video. And that surprises me, considering that Colourbox put out a ton of great movies in the 80s and 90s, including most of Peter Jackson's early horror films and some really nice Italian horror, giallo and erotica. It's stunning that this got a look in. I have to assume that they snapped up the distribution rights based purely on the then pedigree of one of the crew and the title alone. The box makes it very clear that what you're buying has special effects from the creators of Terminator 2. And that carefully written specific wording probably saved it from a number of lawsuits and saved them at least a tiny bit of embarrassment. It was then later released on DVD in the UK in 2007 by Pegasus Entertainment, where it quickly went out of print and is currently listed for a frankly obscene amount of money. It's not yet had a Blu-ray release, but I think it at least deserves a DVD reissue if nothing else. Mainly because this is a classic example of a film to show to film students that indisputably would show them how not to make a movie. Schlock Trashmaster Fred Olen Ray once claimed that this was one of the worst films ever made. And when a bad filmmaker tells you that they've seen a film that they think is a bad film, that isn't a double negative, my friend. You've got something truly awful on your hands. Demon Cop is hilariously awful. A gauntlet of bad decisions, poor planning, and terrible casting create a perfect storm of a picture. And it's hilarious. Absolutely hilarious. A slow but steady first half gives way to a second half that I would firmly put in the same rankings as Nutbag, Blood Theatre and Hobgoblins for just out and out weird, awful cinema that is quite life-changing, honestly. I feel quite enriched for having seen it, and while I definitely won't recommend this one to someone who has more of a standardised film diet, if you like the dark and grubby underfruit of crap cinema, then I'd say this was a must-see.